The Haze of Memories. Ryan, 25 years old and already an echo of a ghost, lived in the quiet, sun-drenched silence of his San Francisco loft. It wasn't just his home, it was a mausoleum to his father, a famed artist whose canvases, once vibrant with life, now gathered dust and sadness in every corner. For 5 years, Ryan had existed in this hazy realm, his own identity slowly dissolving into the unfinished strokes of a man he still couldn't believe was gone. He was an artist, too, but his purpose had narrowed to a single obsessive task: to finish the work his father had left behind. His days were a quiet, methodical ritual. The smell of turpentine and old canvas clung to the air, a scent that was both a comfort and a curse. Ryan would stand for hours before a half-finished portrait, his brush hovering over the canvas, trying to channel a hand that was no longer there. He wasn't creating, he was mourning. He wasn't painting, he was praying. His own paintings sat neglected in a corner, their backs turned to the world, ashamed of their own originality. One dreary Tuesday, while searching for a lost palette knife, his hand brushed against something heavy and dusty beneath his bed. He pulled out a small, unassuming wooden box, latched with a rusty clasp. He didn't recognize it. Prying it open, he found a collection of his father's early sketches, the paper brittle and yellowed with age, and beneath them a leather-bound journal. It was thick with the weight of years and filled with a familiar, elegant script that made his heart ache. He had always believed his father's final words had been left on a canvas, but as he ran his fingers over the worn cover of the book, he felt a flicker of something new. A whisper, a secret, a story waiting to be told. The haze of memories began to shift, and a cold clarity started to set in. The accident, he now suspected, was not the end of the story, but the beginning. The Forgotten Journal. The first few pages of the journal were exactly what Ryan expected. His father's observations on light, his musings on color theory, and quick, intricate sketches of the city skyline filled the pages. Ryan felt a familiar warmth, a small friends in the art world. They didn't just take his work, they took his will to create. A cold, burning knot formed in Ryan's stomach. He flipped through the last few pages, the words a blur of desperation and despair. The final entry, dated the day before the accident, was a single, harrowing sentence. "They've taken everything. I have nothing left to give." Ryan's hands began to shake, the journal slipping from his grasp. It was no accident. The police report, the public eulogies, the well-meaning lies from relatives, it was all a facade. The car crash was not the cause, but the final, devastating effect of a betrayal so profound it had broken a man's spirit. The man he idolized hadn't died by chance. He had been pushed to the edge. The studio was a world unto itself, preserved in a perfect, suffocating stillness. The air was thick with the ghost of his father's last breaths, a mixture of turpentine, linseed oil, and a sadness that was almost palpable. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of light slicing through the high window, illuminating the unfinished work that stood like silent witnesses to a crime. Ryan walked slowly, his footsteps echoing the hollow beat of his heart. He was no longer a son mourning a father, but a detective searching for a motive. He examined the canvases, not for their beauty, but for their truth. He stopped before a half-finished cityscape of the Golden Gate Bridge, a piece his father had been working on feverishly in his last months. The raw emotion was still there. The furious, desperate brushstrokes on the unfinished sky, the vibrant colors of the bridge itself fading into a murky, hopeless gray. As he stared, his eyes traced a pattern on the canvas, a small, intricate swirl of paint in the lower right corner where the signature would have been. It wasn't a mistake or a misplaced drop of color. It was a symbol, 2 letters intertwined like snakes. An elegant E woven into a jagged J, a secret message hidden in plain sight, a final damning accusation left by a man who had lost his voice. The world seemed to spin for a moment, the quiet sanctuary of the each one a silent participant in the lie. The air hummed with hushed praise for the very work his father had poured his life into. His gaze cut through the crowd, landing on the piece that stole his breath, a cityscape of San Francisco, the one his father had been working on. It was centered on a pedestal, illuminated by a halo of spotlights, but it was finished, and the signature at the bottom read, Jack Miller. Ryan's stomach twisted. He saw the sloppy, hurried brushstrokes that filled the unfinished sky, the clumsy lines that completed the bridge's arch. It was like seeing a beautiful, unfinished symphony butchered by a deaf composer. The sacred had been turned into a commodity. He was no longer just sad. He was violently, unforgivingly angry. "Ryan, darling, what a surprise!" Eleanor's voice, as smooth and saccharine as ever, cut through the quiet fury. She appeared beside him, a perfectly coiffed, smiling mask of concern. "I'm so glad you came to see Jack's show." "This isn't Jack's show," Ryan said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my father's show." A flicker of something, fear, recognition, danced in Eleanor's eyes before she covered it with a practiced smile. "Ryan, please, you know how unwell your father was. Jack simply finished his work. It was an homage." "An homage?" Jack sauntered over, a smirk on his face. He held a glass of champagne as if celebrating a victory. "Get real, Ryan. Your old man was a wreck. He couldn't even finish a canvas. I saved his legacy. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a few collectors to speak with." Ryan's rage hardened into a cold, lethal resolve. He stepped closer to Jack, his eyes fixed on him. "This isn't over, Jack. Not by a long shot. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about this masterpiece of yours." He turned and walked away, leaving them in the silent, tense aftermath of his words. Eleanor's face had gone pale, and Jack's arrogant smirk had finally vanished. They knew he wasn't just grieving anymore. He was coming for them, the architect of vengeance. The rage that had boiled inside Ryan as he walked a pallet, the familiar ritual, a grounding force. He would not simply finish the painting. He would replicate his father's style with an almost pathological precision, mimicking every brushstroke, every nuance of color. He was forging a forgery, creating an exact copy of the work Jack had clumsily completed. But this version would contain his father's final, damning message, a subtle key that only an expert would recognize. Within the gentle folds of the tablecloth, he planned to embed a series of tiny, almost invisible symbols, a code that would expose Jack's fraud. His first step, however, was to find an ally. He knew just the man. Arthur Finch was a name whispered with reverence in the art world, a man who had retired from his career as a legendary art critic after his health began to fail. He had been a close confidant of Ryan's father, a man who saw not just the art, but the soul behind it. Ryan found his number on the dusty old business card and hesitated. This was the point of no return. A phone call wasn't just a request. It was a plea for a world-weary old man to risk his entire reputation on a son's desperate claim. "Mr. Finch?" Ryan's voice was strained. "My name is Ryan Miller. My father was Stephen Miller." Silence stretched on the other end, thick with the weight of years. Then a voice, raspy and dry as old parchment, replied, "I remember your father, and I'm sorry for your loss. What can I do for you, son?" "I think my father's death wasn't an accident," Ryan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And I have proof. Ryan's loft became a fortress, a sacred space where he could channel his grief into a weapon. His days were a blur of intense, solitary work. He was no longer a ghost haunting a studio. He was a painter possessed by a purpose. The teacup and orange, a simple still life, became a canvas for his rage. He didn't just paint. He relived his father's final months. The loneliness, the quiet desperation etched into every line and every barely coming out. I've seen him through the window. His eyes narrowed with a predatory gleam. We need to know what he's doing. We need to stop him before he does something stupid. Jack made a few hurried phone calls, and the next day, a man with a nondescript face and a worn leather jacket was seen loitering on the street corner opposite Ryan's loft. He was a low-level private investigator, a man who dealt in hushed whispers and dirty secrets. He took pictures of Ryan coming and going, of the canvas visible through the wide artistic windows. He reported back to Jack the details, a meticulous log of Ryan's obsessive work. The final report was a single, cryptic sentence. He's a man on a mission, and the mission is a painting. This confirmed their worst fears. Ryan wasn't just grieving, he was planning. He was turning his art into a weapon, a silent, beautiful bomb designed to detonate their world. The race was on, and they both knew it. Eleanor's eyes, now filled with a genuine, icy fear, met Jack's. The time for denial was over. They had to act first, before the truth came to light. The trust trap. Ryan's phone call with Arthur Finch had been a success. A single line of trust built on a foundation of shared grief. The retired critic, his voice sharp with a renewed sense of purpose, had agreed to meet him. Ryan knew he couldn't simply rely on the hidden symbols in his painting. He needed a public stage, a moment where his weapon could be seen and understood. He decided to host his own small, private exhibition. It wasn't a grand gallery opening, but a calculated chess move. He sent out invitations to a select group of collectors, critics, and journalists, the very people who had once championed his father's work and had now, unknowingly, become cheerleaders for a fraud. The venue was a small independent gallery a few blocks from his loft, a space with exposed brick walls and an intimate, honest feel. It was the perfect backdrop for his truth. The evening was a nervous blur. He wanted work. It's a little sad, honestly. The room was abuzz with their rumors, the whispers a toxic cloud threatening to smother the evening before it began. Ryan, however, remained calm. He had anticipated their move. This was exactly what he wanted, to draw them into his trap. He walked to the center of the room, standing beside his finished still life. The tiny, elegant canvas seemed to pulse with the quiet power. He didn't raise his voice, but the low, confident tone carried through the room. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, landing for a moment on Eleanor and Jack. "I know many of you are familiar with my father's work. I'm here tonight, not to simply show you a finished piece, but to show you something he left behind." A hush fell over the room as he lifted the still life, turning it slowly under the warm gallery lights. He pointed to the small, almost imperceptible symbols he had embedded in the paint, a detail so subtle it looked like a stray brushstroke to the untrained eye. But he didn't stop there. He pulled out a printed copy of his father's journal and a magnifying glass. "These symbols," he announced, his voice ringing with a cold certainty, "are a secret key. a language he shared with only one other man in the art world. They are a sign of his hand, a signature for the very soul of the piece. As the crowd leaned in, their faces filled with a growing awe, Arthur Finch, who had been standing quietly in the back, stepped forward. He took the magnifying glass from Ryan and examined the canvas, his eyes, old and tired, suddenly sharp and alive. He looked up at Ryan, then back at the painting, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. Eleanor's face went white. Jack's smirk was gone. They knew. The game was over. The Great Unveiling. Arthur Finch, a man whose word had the weight of an art history textbook, held the magnifying glass with a steady hand. He ran it over the intricate swirls in the paint, his gaze lingering on the tiny, deliberate symbols Ryan had so painstakingly placed. A reverent silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft click of cameras. Finch looked up, his eyes meeting Ryan's, a look of profound understanding and sorrow passing between them. He then turned to the crowd, the air like a final, damning judgment. A masterpiece is not just about the lines and colors, he continued, pointing an accusatory finger at a suddenly pale Jack. It's about the soul of the artist. The finished works of Mr. Miller, the ones sold under a false name, are hollow imitations. They are forgeries based on stolen concepts and unfinished canvases. The genius was not in the completion, it was in the inception. And the man who stole that inception stands right there. The whispers in the room erupted into a clamor. Journalists scrambled to take notes. Collectors exchanged shocked, furious glances. All eyes turned to Jack and Eleanor, who were now the center of a different, far less flattering spotlight. "This is ridiculous!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. "Arthur, you're an old man. You're clearly confused. Ryan has manipulated you." "He's a liar," Jack added, his face a mask of furious, panicked rage. "He's just trying to tear me down out of jealousy." But their words fell on deaf ears. Finch's reputation was unassailable. The evidence was right in front of them. Ryan's unfinished painting, the journal, and the cryptic symbols that now seemed to scream the truth. The crowd began to turn away from Eleanor and Jack, their once admiring faces now filled with disgust and betrayal. A respected art dealer pulled out his phone, already calling to cancel a major sale. The art world, a place built on trust and reputation, had just seen a legend exposed as a fraud. Jack's career, built on a foundation of lies, began to crumble into dust. The desperation of Jack. Jack's world didn't just fall apart. It shattered into a million tiny, ugly pieces, each one reflecting his own shame. The phone in his penthouse apartment rang incessantly with the venom of canceled commissions and scathing articles. A gallery owner who had once fawned over him called to say he was no longer welcome. His agent, a woman who once promised him the world, sent a curt email terminating their contract. He was a pariah, a living monument who told me what to do. You're the one who told me to take his paintings. You're the one who said his father was a broken man and that we were saving his legacy. He was on his feet now, a wild, desperate animal pacing a cage. This was your idea. I was just your puppet. Her eyes, cold and empty, finally met his. And you were a very willing puppet, weren't you, darling? You enjoyed the money, the fame, the praise. You enjoyed playing the part of a genius. Don't blame me for your weakness. That was the breaking point. The mask of a son's love for his mother shattered, revealing a lifetime of manipulation and control. Jack looked at the woman who had raised him, not as a parent, but as a puppeteer. and he saw the face of the enemy. He stormed out of the apartment, the door slamming behind him with a final, echoing thud. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away, to find someone who would listen to the full, devastating truth. He pulled out his phone, his mind a frantic mess, and dialed the only number he could think of. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice, quiet and guarded, answered. "Ryan?" Jack said, his voice cracking with a raw mixture of fear and confession. "I need to talk to you. I need to tell you everything." Ryan met him at the loft. Jack was a ghost of the arrogant man he had confronted just days before, his clothes rumpled, his eyes red, a gaunt, hollow look on his face. He collapsed onto an old, paint-splattered couch, and the words, once trapped behind years of deceit, tumbled out in a chaotic, desperate torrent. He told Ryan about Eleanor's cold, unfeeling nature, her obsession with her own status, and her deep-seated bitterness towards Stephen. He explained how she had slowly but surely poisoned Stephen's mind, convincing him his art was worthless, that his love was unrequited, and that the world had forgotten him. She told him that his masterpiece was just a piece of junk, Jack confessed, his voice barely a whisper. She told him his death anymore. He was a witness to a murder, and the killer he now knew was a woman who had once claimed to be family. He had to face her, not for vengeance, but for the truth. He called Eleanor, his voice unnervingly calm. "I know," he said simply. "I know everything. Meet me at the bridge. Now." He hung up before she could respond, not wanting to hear her practice lies. The setting sun cast a long, mournful shadow over the Golden Gate Bridge as Ryan stood, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He watched as a sleek black car pulled up and Eleanor stepped out, her designer coat clutched tightly around her. She was a vision of expensive perfection, but her eyes, wide and panicked, betrayed the terror she felt beneath the mask. She approached him, her smile a thin, desperate line. "Ryan, darling, what is this about?" she began, her voice a practiced saccharine melody. "Jack is unwell. I'm so worried about him." Ryan didn't rise to the bait. He held up the journal. "You're not here for Jack. You're here for this." He opened the book to the final damning page, the words a raw, visceral accusation. "This is my father's final entry. The day before his accident." Eleanor's facade faltered. Her eyes darted from the page to Ryan's face, 1,000 lies forming and dissolving behind her panic stare. "Ryan, I don't know what this is. This is a cruel joke. Jack must have put you up to this." Jack told me everything. Ryan's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a scream. He told me about the painting, the lies, the isolation. He told me you drove him here, that you told him his death would be his final, greatest work. Eleanor flinched, the mask cracked. A raw, unbridled fury, old and ugly and venomous, finally erupted from within her. "He was so weak!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the wind. "He was always so weak! I gave him everything, my time, my mind, my energy, and he just wouldn't give me what I wanted. He wouldn't love me back." The words were a brute for it. But Ryan had no more words. He looked at the monster standing before him, a woman whose unrequited love had poisoned a genius and destroyed a family. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel vengeance. He just felt an immense, suffocating sorrow. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. He had to make her face justice, not for the sake of his revenge, but for the sake of his father's soul. The weight of forgiveness. The air in the loft, once thick with the ghosts of his father's final breaths, had shifted. It was now filled with the stale silence of a truth revealed, a silence that was far more deafening than any scream. Ryan sat on the edge of his bed, the old journal on his lap, a physical weight that pressed down on him. The knowledge he had gained was not a prize, it was a burden. He had sought revenge and had found only a deeper, more profound form of pain. His father hadn't just died. He had been a victim of a cruel, slow poison, a man whose spirit had been broken long before his body was. The fury that had driven him to expose Jack and confront Eleanor was gone, replaced by an immense, suffocating sorrow. He had watched Eleanor's perfect mask shatter, not to reveal a monster he could hate, but to expose a woman broken by her own envy. And Jack. Jack was not the co-conspirator he had imagined. He was a son manipulated by a mother's venom, a pawn in a game he never understood. Ryan looked at the phone in his hand, his finger hovering over Jack's number. He wasn't calling to gloat. He was calling to forgive. He had to. The path of vengeance was a dead end, a bottomless pit that would only consume him, just as it had consumed Eleanor. He knew with a sudden, aching clarity that the only way to honor his father was not to seek revenge for his death, but to live for his own life. When Jack answered, his voice was thin and broken. Ryan's voice, for the first time in years, was gentle.
It's Miller, a ghost in her own right now, was serving a life sentence, her once pristine life shattered by the truth. Jack was a long way from the city, working in the small, quiet studio in the mountains, trying to build a new life for himself, one based on honesty and genuine effort. The scandal was a memory, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones at gallery openings. But for Ryan, the journey had just begun. He had spent the last year not trying to finish his father's work, but trying to understand it. And in doing so, he had begun to understand his own. He had left the old loft, a mausoleum to his grief, and found a new studio, a place with a wide, airy window that looked out over the Pacific. Here, he painted for himself. Not for a ghost, not for a reputation, but for the simple, pure joy of creation. His style was different from his father's, a raw, vibrant expression of a man who had been through a storm and found his way to a quiet harbor. He had organized a new exhibition. It wasn't a trap or a tool for revenge. It was an act of reconciliation and closure. The gallery was filled with a mix of his father's unfinished masterpieces and his own new works. The centerpiece was the Golden Gate Bridge canvas, the one that had been the subject of so much deceit. But now, it wasn't a piece of evidence. It was a monument to a father's life, a testament to a man who had found a way to speak even after he had lost his voice. Ryan stood before it, the canvas bathed in the warm, quiet glow of the gallery lights. He was not a son haunted by a ghost. He was an artist, standing in a room with his own past, and for the first time in his life, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and filled with a darkness he never could have imagined, but it had led him here, to this moment, to this quiet understanding. His father's legacy wasn't a collection of unfinished canvases. It was the spirit of a man who had found a way to create, even in the face of despair. And Ryan's own legacy, he knew, was not to live in his father's shadow, but to step into his own light. He looked at the painting, a ghost of a smile on his lips. His father's journey was over. His own was just beginning.